The telephone rang at 7:30 on the morning of June 6, 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, picked up the receiver and heard what he had been dreading for months. Allied forces were landing in Normandy. Thousands of paratroopers had dropped inland. Naval bombardment had begun. The invasion was happening now. Von Rundstedt understood military mathematics with the clarity that came from 5 decades of service. The Panzer divisions held in reserve near Paris were approximately 120 miles from the Norman coast. If they moved immediately, they could reach the beaches by late afternoon. The Allies would still be consolidating their positions, still vulnerable, still dependent on supplies coming across the beaches rather than through captured ports. But the Panzer divisions represented Germany's only operational reserve in the West. Committing them meant the die was cast. If they failed, if they were destroyed attacking the beachhead, nothing stood between the Allies and Paris. Nothing protected the road to Germany itself. This was the terrible calculus facing every German commander on June 6th. Every decision carried existential consequences, and the authority to make those decisions rested not with the field commanders who understood the situation, but with Adolf Hitler, hundreds of miles away in Bavaria, asleep. The command structure guaranteed failure. Von Rundstedt commanded the Western Theatre, but could not move major units without permission from OKW, the Armed Forces High Command, which meant Hitler. Rommel commanded Army Group B but answered to von Rundstedt for some decisions and directly to Hitler for others. The Panzer divisions belonged to Panzer Group West, commanded by General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, who disagreed with both Rommel and von Rundstedt about how to employ armour. 3 brilliant commanders, each with valid strategic insights, each with a piece of operational authority, none with the power to make unified decisions. It was a system designed to fail. Von Rundstedt's response was immediate and correct. He ordered 2 Panzer divisions held in reserve near Paris to move immediately toward the Norman coast. The divisions could reach the beaches in hours. They could counterattack before the Allies established a secure foothold. They could drive the invaders back into the sea. But within minutes, the old field marshal received a second call. His orders were cancelled. The Panzer divisions were under the direct control of the Führer. Only Adolf Hitler could authorize their movement. And Adolf Hitler was asleep, the man who would decide the fate of Europe, the man who controlled Germany's only hope of repelling the invasion, had gone to bed at 3 in the morning after entertaining propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. He would not wake until noon, and when he finally did wake, he would make the single worst decision of his military career. He would declare that Normandy was a feint, a diversion, and that the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. The mathematics of June 6, 1944, tell a story of systematic German failure so complete, so catastrophic, that it borders on the incomprehensible. 156,000 Allied troops landed on French soil in 24 hours. Not in a week, not in a month, in a single day. And the German response, the vaunted Wehrmacht that had conquered Europe, managed to launch exactly 1 armoured counterattack. 1. This is not a story about Allied brilliance, though brilliance was certainly present. This is a story about German paralysis, about a command structure so dysfunctional, so infected by political interference and personal animosity, that it could not respond effectively to the most predictable military crisis of the war. The Allies had been massing troops in England for over a year. Everyone knew an invasion was coming. The only questions were when and where. And, yet when it came, the Germans were caught completely unprepared. The scale of Allied preparation was staggering, and German intelligence had captured only fragments of the true picture. By May of 1944, over 2.8 million Allied troops had massed in southern England. The British Isles had been transformed into what General Dwight D. Eisenhower called the greatest operating military base of all time. 7 million tons of supplies had been shipped across the Atlantic, 450,000 tons of ammunition, over 5,000 ships had been assembled for the invasion fleet. 11,000 aircraft had been assigned to Operation Overlord. The Americans alone had sent 1.4 million soldiers to England, overwhelming the British transportation system, filling every available barracks, camping in fields, sleeping in requisitioned country estates. German reconnaissance aircraft, the few that could penetrate Allied air defences, photographed endless rows of landing craft in British ports. German agents, most of whom were actually double agents working for British intelligence, sent reports of troop concentrations. German radar stations along the French coast tracked the massive increase in Allied air activity. All of this intelligence pointed to one inescapable conclusion: a massive invasion was imminent. And yet, the German High Command could not agree on where it would come or how to respond to it. The paralysis was not from lack of information. It was from an inability to make decisive strategic choices in a command structure poisoned by personal rivalries and Hitler's increasingly erratic interference. The story of Germany's catastrophic failure at Normandy begins not on June 6th, but months earlier, in the bitter strategic disagreements between two of Germany's most respected field marshals. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in France in November of 1943 with a reputation forged in the deserts of North Africa, the Desert Fox, the master of mobile warfare, the general who had brought the British to the edge of defeat at Tobruk. Hitler had given him a simple mission: inspect the Atlantic Wall, Germany's supposedly impregnable chain of fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain, and prepare to defeat the coming Allied invasion. What Rommel found horrified him. The Atlantic Wall was a fiction. Oh, the bunkers existed. The gun emplacements were real enough. Hitler had ordered the construction of 15,000 permanent fortifications to defend against invasion. By the time Rommel arrived, only 8,000 had been completed, and most of those were concentrated in the wrong places. The German High Command, including Rommel's superior, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, believed the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It was the obvious choice. Only 21 miles of water separated England from France at Calais. Allied bombers and fighters could provide continuous cover. The distance was short enough that landing craft could make multiple trips in a single day. So the Germans had concentrated their best fortifications at Calais. Massive concrete bunkers housing naval guns capable of hitting ships miles offshore. Interconnected trenches and machine gun nests covering every approach. Minefields so dense that engineers estimated 4 million mines had been planted in the Calais sector alone. But Rommel was not convinced. He had spent time studying aerial photographs and intelligence reports. He believed the Allies might land elsewhere, perhaps Normandy, perhaps the Cotentin Peninsula, perhaps anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline that remained weakly defended. More fundamentally, Rommel understood something that most of the German High Command did not. Allied air power had changed everything. Rommel had experienced Allied air superiority firsthand in North Africa. He had watched as Spitfires and Hurricanes systematically destroyed his supply lines. He had seen what happened when German armoured columns tried to move in daylight under clear skies. they were slaughtered. This shaped Rommel's entire defensive philosophy. The invasion, he argued, had to be stopped on the beaches, immediately, before the Allies could establish a foothold. Before they could bring ashore the tanks and artillery that would make dislodging them impossible. To accomplish this, Rommel demanded that Germany's Panzer divisions, the elite armoured formations that remained the Wehrmacht's most potent offensive weapon, be stationed as close to the coast as possible. When the invasion came, they would counterattack instantly, driving into the landing forces while they were still disorganized, still vulnerable, still exposed to the guns of the Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal von Rundstedt disagreed completely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Von Rundstedt was a traditional officer of the old school. 70 years old in 1944, he had served in the Kaiser's army during World War I. He believed in orthodox military doctrine, defense in depth, mobile reserves, concentration of force at the decisive point. From von Rundstedt's perspective, Rommel's plan was madness. Stationing Panzer divisions near the coast made them vulnerable to naval gunfire. The massive guns of Allied battleships could destroy tanks from miles away, as they had done during the landings at Salerno in Italy. Far better to hold the armour back, away from the coast, concentrated in a central reserve. When the main Allied landing came, wherever it came, the Panzers would move forward en masse and crush the invaders in a devastating counterattack. The strategic disagreement was more than academic. It reflected two fundamentally incompatible visions of how to fight the coming battle. And both men believed correctly that the fate of Germany hung on who was right. Hitler's solution satisfied no one. He compromised. Each army group would receive 3 Panzer divisions to deploy as they wished. 4 divisions would remain in a central reserve. But these 4 critical divisions would be under Hitler's personal control. They could not move without his direct authorization. In trying to placate both commanders, Hitler had created a command structure that guaranteed paralysis. When the invasion came, the forward Panzer divisions would be too few to stop it. The reserve divisions would be too far away to intervene quickly, and any decision to commit them would require navigating the labyrinthine command structure of the Third Reich, where fear of the Führer's displeasure often outweighed military necessity. While the German generals argued about Panzers, Rommel threw himself into the only task he could control, strengthening the Atlantic Wall. Under Rommel's relentless supervision, the pace of construction accelerated dramatically. In the first 4 months of 1944, German engineers built over 4,600 new fortifications along the Atlantic coast. That matched the construction rate of the entire previous year. Rommel personally designed many of the beach obstacles that would greet the invaders. Wooden posts topped with telemines, explosive devices that would detonate when struck by a landing craft's hull, concrete tetrahedra, pyramid-shaped obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of boats, steel hedgehogs, twisted assemblies of railway track that could tear through armour plate, Czech hedgehogs, simple X-shaped steel frames that blocked tanks. By June of 1944, over 500,000 obstacles had been planted on the beaches and in the shallow waters offshore. In Normandy alone, 6 million mines had been laid. Fields behind the beaches were filled with Rommelspargel, Rommel's asparagus, tall wooden stakes designed to impale gliders attempting to land. Low-lying areas were deliberately flooded to create impassable marshes. The construction consumed enormous resources. The organization TOT, the Nazi engineering corps responsible for fortification work, employed over 1.4 million workers. Most were not German. They were French civilians drafted into forced labour, or prisoners of war, or slave labourers from concentration camps. They poured millions of cubic metres of concrete. They installed thousands of artillery pieces in reinforced bunkers with walls 3.5 meters thick enough to withstand direct hits from battleship shells. And yet, for all this frantic effort, Rommel knew the truth. The Atlantic Wall was incomplete. It would always be incomplete. Germany simply did not have the resources to fortify every mile of coastline to the standard Rommel deemed necessary. In his diary, Rommel wrote with uncharacteristic pessimism, "The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that's while he's in the water, struggling to get ashore. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." Rommel was right. But he would not be there to see it. On June 4th, 1944, weather reports indicated that the English Channel would experience severe storms over the following week. Winds up to 30 miles per hour, rain, rough seas, conditions that made amphibious operations impossible. Rommel made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He drove to Germany to spend a day with his wife Lucy. It was her birthday, and besides, the weather made an invasion impossible. The Allies wouldn't come in a storm. Rommel wasn't the only senior German commander who judged the weather too poor for invasion. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army defending Normandy, scheduled a command post exercise for June 6th, a war game, a tabletop simulation of how to respond to an Allied landing. His division commanders were ordered to Rennes, miles from their headquarters, to participate. General Wilhelm Falley, commanding the 91st Air Landing Division, was driving to Rennes when the invasion began. He heard the roar of thousands of aircraft engines overhead. He ordered his driver to turn around and race back to headquarters. As his car pulled onto the grounds, American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division opened fire. Falley became the first German general to die in Normandy. The Allies had not waited for good weather. They had launched the largest amphibious invasion in history into a storm. At 1:15 in the morning on June 6th, German radar stations along the Norman coast began detecting massive formations of aircraft approaching from England. Within minutes, reports flooded into Army headquarters. Paratroopers were landing inland. Thousands of them. Around the basin, the Cotentin Peninsula. East of the Orne River, cutting roads, seizing bridges, destroying communications lines. At first, the reports seemed impossible to believe. Paratroopers in a storm? In darkness? In winds that would scatter them across the countryside? It had to be a mistake. Or a diversion. Or dummy troops. The Allies were known to drop mannequins equipped with pyrotechnics to simulate parachute landings and confuse German defences. But the reports kept coming. And they were not about mannequins. British airborne troops seized the bridges over the Quéant Canal and the Orne River intact. American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division landed in flooded marshland behind Utah Beach. Many drowned, weighed down by equipment. Others landed scattered across miles of countryside, lost, disoriented, but gathering into small groups and moving toward their objectives. At 6:30 in the morning, just as dawn broke over the Norman coast, the naval bombardment began. German soldiers in the coastal fortifications had never experienced anything like it. Over 5,000 Allied ships filled the horizon. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all firing simultaneously. The sound was beyond description. A continuous rolling thunder that shook the ground. shattered windows miles inland, and made speech impossible. 14-inch shells from battleships struck concrete bunkers with the force of earthquakes. Smaller ships poured thousands of rounds onto the beaches, onto the bluffs behind the beaches, onto any position that might hold German troops. The bombardment was supposed to destroy the defences. In practice, it terrorized the defenders and destroyed some positions, but the thickest bunkers survived intact. Their German crews, deafened and shaken, stumbled back to their guns when the shelling lifted. And then the landing craft came. Across 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword, 156,000 Allied troops stormed ashore. Americans at Utah and Omaha, British and Canadians at Gold, Juno and Sword. They came in waves, thousands of boats carrying men who waded through chest-deep water while German machine guns opened fire. At Omaha Beach, the carnage was apocalyptic. The preliminary bombardment had missed most of the German fortifications. The veteran 352nd Infantry Division held the high ground and poured fire down onto the beach. Men died before they could leave their landing craft. Others drowned in deep water, their equipment pulling them under. The beach became a killing ground, bodies and equipment scattered across the sand. But at Utah, Gold, Juno and Sword, the landings succeeded quickly. Casualties were heavy, but manageable. The German defenders, despite their concrete bunkers and interlocking fields of fire, could not stop 156,000 men supported by thousands of aircraft and naval guns. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies controlled a foothold. 50 miles wide, they had lost approximately 10,300 men killed, wounded, or missing. A terrible price. But they were ashore, and they were not leaving. For the Germans, June 6th was a catastrophe of compounding failures. Rommel was in Germany. He did not learn of the invasion until late morning. He immediately began the long drive back to his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon, unable to fly because Allied aircraft controlled the skies. He would not arrive until evening, too late to influence the day's events. Hitler was asleep. His staff, terrified of waking him, delayed reporting the invasion. When Hitler finally woke around noon, he received the news with what witnesses described as almost cheerful confidence. "The news couldn't be better," Hitler reportedly said. "As long as they were in England, we couldn't get at them. Now we have them where we can destroy them." But Hitler refused to authorize the release of the Panzer reserves. He believed, or wanted to believe, that Normandy was a feint. The real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. The reserve Panzer divisions had to be held back for the real threat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It was not until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, nearly 10 hours after the first troops landed, that Hitler finally authorized 2 Panzer divisions, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr, to move toward Normandy. By then, the window of opportunity had closed. In the early morning, when von Rundstedt had first requested authorization to move the Panzers, the weather was overcast. Thick clouds blanketed northern France. German tanks could have moved without serious interference from Allied aircraft. They could have reached the beaches in daylight. They might have counterattacked while Allied forces were still disorganized. But by late afternoon, when Hitler finally gave his authorization, the clouds had broken up. Allied fighter bombers, Thunderbolts and Typhoons and Mustangs ruled the skies. Any German unit that moved in daylight was systematically destroyed. Panzer Lehr began its approach to Normandy and was caught in the open by Allied aircraft. Rocket-firing typhoons destroyed tanks, trucks, fuel tankers. The division commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, had objected to moving in daylight. He had seen what Allied air power could do in North Africa. He was overruled. His division was decimated before it reached the battlefield. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed in southern France, began moving toward Normandy on June 7th. The journey should have taken 2 days. It took 2 weeks. French resistance fighters blew up bridges, cut rail lines, and ambushed supply columns. Allied aircraft destroyed anything that moved. Along the way, enraged by the constant harassment, SS troops committed atrocities, including the massacre of 642 civilians in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. By the time Das Reich reached Normandy, the battle for the beaches was over. The Allies had won. Only one German armoured formation managed to launch a counterattack on June 6th. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed southeast of Caen, reacted quickly to the airborne landings. Its commander, General Edgar Feuchtinger, gathered his scattered units and moved north toward the British landing beaches. Around 4 in the afternoon, elements of the 21st Panzer broke through thinly held British positions and reached the coast between Sword and Juno beaches. For a few minutes, German tanks sat on the beach, their guns trained on the masses of Allied ships offshore. It was the closest the Germans came to throwing the invaders back into the sea. But the 21st Panzer was alone. No other units supported it. British reinforcements began arriving. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers poured shells into the German positions. And overhead, the invasion armada was delivering another wave. Hundreds of gliders, towed by transport aircraft, released over the battlefield and began landing all around the German tanks. General Feuchtinger made the correct decision. He withdrew. Without infantry support, without air cover, without any prospect of reinforcement, his tanks were simply targets. By nightfall, the 21st Panzer had pulled back to defensive positions around Cayenne. That single counterattack was the entire German armoured response on D-Day. 1 division. Out of 10 Panzer divisions stationed in France, the mathematics explain everything. The Allies landed 156,000 troops in 24 hours. They did this using over 5,000 ships. They provided air cover with over 13,000 aircraft. They delivered overwhelming firepower through naval bombardment that German defenders described as apocalyptic. Against this, the Germans managed to commit 1 Panzer division and the static coastal defence troops already in position. No strategic reserves. No air cover, the Luftwaffe could muster only 300 sorties over Normandy on June 6th, and most of those planes never reached the battlefield. No naval support. Germany's surface fleet was non-existent in the Channel. The failure was not tactical. Individual German units fought with the skill and determination expected of Wehrmacht soldiers. The 352nd Infantry Division turned Omaha Beach into a slaughterhouse. The 21st Panzer executed a textbook counterattack. Dozens of bunkers held out for hours against overwhelming firepower. The failure was strategic, operational, and systemic. Germany's command structure was paralyzed by Hitler's insistence on personal control of operational decisions. The Führer had to authorize major troop movements, but the Führer was asleep, or unavailable, or convinced the real invasion was coming elsewhere. Germany's intelligence had been deceived by one of history's most successful deception operations. Operation Fortitude had convinced Hitler and his staff that Pas-de-Calais was the invasion target. Fake armies, false radio traffic, double agents feeding disinformation to German intelligence. The deception was so successful that even after Normandy, Hitler held elite divisions at Calais for weeks, waiting for an invasion that never came. Germany's military had been hollowed out by years of attrition on the Eastern Front. The best divisions, the most experienced troops, the bulk of Germany's armour, all were fighting desperately to hold back Soviet offensives. The forces in France were a mixture of elite units recovering from the east, low-quality garrison troops, and Ost battalions. Formations made up of Soviet prisoners of war with questionable loyalty. And critically, Germany had lost the air war. In his after-action report filed 2 weeks after the invasion, Field Marshal von Rundstedt listed 4 key factors that enabled Allied success. At the top of his list, above everything else, was complete mastery in the air. Allied air superiority meant German units could not move in daylight. It meant reconnaissance was impossible. It meant supply lines were constantly disrupted. It meant any concentration of forces would be spotted and destroyed before it could attack. Rommel had warned about this. Von Rundstedt had dismissed his concerns. On June 6th, Rommel was proved correct. The Panzer divisions that von Rundstedt had kept in reserve could not reach the battlefield. Allied aircraft destroyed them on the roads. By the time Rommel returned to his headquarters on the evening of June 6th, the battle was effectively over. The Allies had established their beachhead. Over the following days and weeks, they would expand it. By the end of June, 850,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy, along with 148,000 vehicles and 570,000 tons of supplies. The Germans could not match these numbers. Every division sent to Normandy had to travel hundreds of miles under constant air attack. Every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, had to be transported along roads and rail lines that were systematically destroyed by Allied bombers. On June 17th, Rommel and von Rundstedt met with Hitler at Margeval, north of Paris. Rommel, emboldened by desperation, told Hitler the truth. The invasion could not be stopped. German forces in Normandy were being ground down by Allied material superiority. The Luftwaffe could not contest the skies. The Panzers could not maneuver under constant air attack. Germany was losing. Rommel suggested, carefully, that perhaps political solutions should be considered. Perhaps it was time to negotiate. Hitler exploded with rage. There would be no negotiations, no retreats. German forces would stand fast, fight to the last man, and wait for the miracle weapons, V-1 rockets and jet aircraft, that would turn the tide. The meeting ended with nothing resolved. On June 29th, Rommel and von Rundstedt met with Hitler again at Berchtesgaden. The situation in Normandy had deteriorated further. Both field marshals argued that the existing defensive line had become untenable. They needed to conduct a limited withdrawal, pull back to more defensible positions outside the range of Allied naval guns, reorganize, and then counterattack with concentrated force. Hitler refused, not one step back. After the meeting, von Rundstedt had a telephone conversation with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief of staff. Keitel asked what should be done. Von Rundstedt's reply was blunt and suicidal. "Make peace, you idiots. What else can you do?" Within days, von Rundstedt was relieved of command. His replacement was Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who arrived convinced that the situation could be salvaged through more aggressive tactics. Within weeks, von Kluge was sending the same messages von Rundstedt had sent. The situation was hopeless. Rommel lasted slightly longer. On July 17th, his staff car was strafed by Allied fighters. Rommel was severely wounded, his skull fractured. He would never return to active command. 3 days later, on July 20th, a bomb exploded in Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. The assassination attempt failed, but Hitler's paranoia intensified. Rommel, through his association with some of the plotters, came under suspicion. On October 14th, he was given a choice: face trial for treason, which would mean execution and disgrace for his family, or commit suicide and be given a state funeral. Rommel took poison. Germany's greatest field commander died because he had told Hitler the truth. The war was lost. The Normandy campaign dragged on through the summer. KN, which the British had hoped to capture on D-Day, did not fall until late July. The bocage, the hedgerow country of Normandy, turned every field into a fortified position. German defenders, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperate skill, but the mathematics were inexorable. Every German division destroyed in Normandy could not be replaced. Every tank knocked out, every gun captured, represented losses Germany could not afford. The Allies, by contrast, could replace their losses easily. More troops, more tanks, more supplies flooded ashore every day. On July 25th, American forces launched Operation Cobra, a massive offensive that broke through German lines near Saint-Lô. The breakthrough unleashed American armor into open country. Within weeks, German forces in Normandy were encircled in the Falaise pocket. 50,000 soldiers surrendered. An entire German army ceased to exist. Paris was liberated on August 25th. By September, Allied forces were on Germany's border. The Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years would survive less than a year more. The invasion that Hitler had believed he could stop on the beaches had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic Allied projections. And it had succeeded, fundamentally, because Germany's command structure was so dysfunctional that it could not respond effectively to a threat everyone knew was coming. The tragedy of June 6, 1944, from the German perspective, was that many of the mistakes were avoidable. If Rommel had been given control of all the Panzer divisions and stationed them near likely invasion beaches, the Allies would have faced immediate counterattacks on D-Day. Would this have stopped the invasion? Probably not. Allied firepower was simply too overwhelming, but it might have made the cost prohibitive. It might have turned Normandy into a bloodbath that forced the Allies to reconsider their strategy. If Hitler had not insisted on personal control of operational reserves, von Rundstedt could have committed the Panzers immediately on the morning of June 6th, while weather still protected them from Allied air attack. Those divisions might have reached the beaches in time to contest the landings. If German intelligence had not been so thoroughly deceived by Allied deception operations, Hitler might not have held elite divisions at Calais for weeks after Normandy. Those divisions, committed to the Normandy battle in the first week, could have made the difference between a contested beachhead and Allied breakthrough. But none of these things happened. Hitler insisted on control and delayed authorization. Von Rundstedt's reserves sat paralyzed while the invasion succeeded. Rommel's warnings about Allied air power were ignored until it was too late. The Atlantic Wall, that massive fortification system that had consumed millions of hours of labor and cubic meters of concrete, was breached in hours. The bunkers and obstacles and mines inflicted casualties. They made the invasion bloody. But they did not stop it, and in the final analysis, they could never have stopped it. Because the Atlantic Wall was not merely a physical structure, it was a symbol of a strategic failure Germany could never overcome. No amount of concrete could compensate for lost air superiority, for inadequate reserves, for a command structure paralyzed by one man's megalomaniacal insistence on personal control. 156,000 troops in 24 hours. That was the measure of Allied capability. That was the arithmetic that doomed the Third Reich. German generals looked at those numbers and understood. The war was over. Germany had lost. Not in some future battle, but right here, on June 6, 1944, when Allied troops stormed ashore and Germany could not stop them. Everything after D-Day was just the slow, terrible process of making that reality undeniable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.